Good morning. My name is Toby Heaps, and I'm the CEO of Corporate Knights. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation today, this event that we're co-hosting with the Dutch Embassy on mobilizing the green transition. We're going to be looking closely at a necessary formula, which is how industry and government can work together to deliver and move the dial on the green transition. And it's the only way we're going to be able to move as quickly as we need to is with all hands on deck, business, industry, and civil society, although today we'll be focusing on the business industry nexus. Many Canadians have a special place in their hearts for the Netherlands. In my family, it was always a big part of the folklore, as my great-grandfather had been part of the escape from Arnhem and the parachuted into the Netherlands. And after he escaped from the Germans, he had hooked up with the Dutch resistance and ran many operations during the Second World War to help bring about its conclusion. And so in our family, the Netherlands was always a special place. And I remember riding through the beautiful countryside on my bike with my grandfather back on the 50th anniversary of the escape from Arnhem, and all the warm feelings that you could feel between our two countries from that moment, and many other things that have happened since. Also, as many people here will know who have been to the Netherlands or who are in the Netherlands, for Canadians, when we go over there, it always feels like we're going into the future in some way. You know, you can rollerblade on beautiful paths with your own traffic lights all the way from downtown to Schiphol Airport. And so it's a great opportunity for us today to bring our communities together, the business sector and government, to look at what we can do together and what we can learn from one another to start to accelerate and move at the speed that it's becoming clearly apparent that we need to move at, and it's a faster speed than we're going right now. Before we get underway, I'd just like to make a brief land acknowledgement. Corporate Knights honors the people and land of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. So before we get away to the discussion, we have two special people here who are going to provide a little bit of context. First, it's my great pleasure to introduce Her Excellency, Ines Kopuse, the Ambassador of the Embassy of the Kingdom of Netherlands to Canada. Ambassador.
Thank you, Toby. Good morning and good afternoon to you all. My name is Ines Kopuse. I'm the Ambassador of the Netherlands to Canada. And Toby, like you explained that the Netherlands has a special place in the heart of many Canadians, it's also the other way around. Canada is holding absolutely a special place in the heart of many, many Dutchmen. And this special relationship that we have with each other also results in a lot of very concrete cooperation. So for me, being the Dutch ambassador to Canada, it's just the place to be. We have so much going on right now. So with that, it's of course also a privilege to do some opening remarks for an event with such wonderful speakers. And I certainly look forward to a highly valuable and engaging discussion with hopefully also some conclusions or recommendations that will inspire us and that we can put into practice. Now, the idea for this event originated with an agreement among our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the leaders of the Dutch Sustainable Growth Coalition to work together to mobilize collaboration on the local level with the goal to increase climate ambition and action. And for those of you who are unaware, this coalition is led by the CEOs of the 8 largest multinationals in the Netherlands, who are all united in their commitment to make substantial contributions to the SDGs. At our embassy, we cherish, of course, the close and well-established relations with the local representatives of these corporations here in Canada, 3 of whom will join us for this event today, from Philips, KLM, and Shell. And personally, I'm also very pleased that all 3 speakers representing these multinationals are women. Each of them is playing a crucial leading role in championing the adoption of sustainable practices, and they trigger discussions and conversations within their respective organizations on the much needed changes. I'm also delighted that our recently appointed climate envoy for the Netherlands is here to join us. He has been a long-time advocate for clean energy and sustainable solutions, and he brings a wealth of knowledge from his previous positions, but also a drive and a passion for the need to preserve our precious planet. And of course, it's great to have representatives from both the Business Council of Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, who can share with us the initiatives being pursued by both the Canadian government and the private sector, and say something on the innovative ways in which private-public partnerships are already being adopted here in Canada. Now, both our countries recognize the critical need for government-industry collaboration in order to reduce our emissions and make our businesses and our societies more resilient, more sustainable, and resource efficient. The Dutch government commits to ensuring that our industry will set the standard for sustainability in Europe and worldwide. And of course, it will not be easy, and it will require a green industrial policy, an approach based on reciprocity between public authorities, businesses, and society. But we recognize that it's vital that we raise our level of ambition in the Netherlands in relation to our commitments if we wish to achieve our reduction targets. So with that, Toby, let me conclude by thanking our co-host, Corporate Knights, wonderful name, for your excellent partnership in kickstarting this event. And I would also like to thank my embassy team here in Ottawa, in particular our colleague Taylor Heaven. And I hope, well, no, I know that this roundtable will not mark the last time that you will all engage with each other. And I certainly look forward to seeing the results that will emerge from your continued collaboration. Keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's now my pleasure to introduce His Royal Highness Prince Jaime de Bourbon de Parma. Prince Jaime is the climate envoy of the Netherlands. And Jaime, it'd be interesting for us to understand, many Canadians may not realize exactly how the Netherlands National Climate Agreement came together, but it was a joint effort involving industry and government and reaching a consensus to come up with some pretty ambitious emissions reductions measures and targets. Can you walk us through how that actually worked out?
Absolutely, Toby. And first, a side note, a personal note. You mentioned your youth and your history. My family history has been tied to Canada as well, as the Dutch royal family was housed in Canada during the Second World War, and it was Canadian soldiers, giving their lives to free the Netherlands. So it's been a very strong tie there, and that has continued until now. So it's great to be with you, and I see people from all over the world actually linking into this call. I see people from Africa, from Australia, from Europe, and North America calling into this. So we see that the great wars were global things, but climate change is something that it's team humanity that needs to make a difference and going beyond nation states. So we need to work together. And the Netherlands response, just so you understand, we're part of Europe. So it's the EU that set the ambition for Europe, and it's leading globally. But within Europe, each member state will have to make its own climate policy and plan, so that the joint plans make the European stance. And our national climate agreement was signed in 2019. And as you said, Toby, it was a collaborative effort of the central government, the provinces, municipalities, also the private sector, NGOs, and knowledge institutions. And doing that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, but we're used to that in the Netherlands, and it's part of our culture. And you upfront a lot of effort, but then once you make a decision, you have everybody's buy-in, and then rolling it out makes it a lot easier. And we've created 5 tables, we call it 5 round tables, to push this national climate agreement forward. One on electricity, the other one on industry, then one on built environment, one on traffic and transport, and one on agriculture. And that's where the different parts of the plan were constructed. And let me just use one example, that of greening the industry. And the industry table came with, say, 2 models, one clean industry and the other one was a smart industry. And the clean industry talked, how we should move beyond gas, because the Netherlands is very gas dependent and that's running out and we're phasing out. But how do we move beyond it towards sustainable electricity, green hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage? So that table discussed it and came with a finance solution, which is on one hand that the government increases the cost of greenhouse gas emissions. So we focus on 250 largest companies in the Netherlands that are good for 80% of the greenhouse gas industry emissions. And we added a carbon price on top of the EU system on emission trading. So it became relatively more expensive to emit in the Netherlands, even than in the rest of Europe. But on the other hand, we compensated that with subsidies to those companies that invested in green energy production and carbon capture and storage. So we gave an extra price, but also an extra benefit at the same time to shift the needle. And this was agreed upon amongst these multi-stakeholder actors. So you have the buy-in. And then that's the clean industry. But the smart industry was that if we focus on energy efficiency one hand, but there's also always residual warmth, waste, and emissions of one company. And we try to use that as an input for other companies. So just think of excess heat that can go into heating water for, say, shrimp farms in the harbor of Rotterdam, or it can be used as heat for the municipality. So we try to then reduce the CO2. So if it can't be reduced at the industry level, then across industries or municipalities. So that's the way we dealt with this. And yeah, many of the companies actually on this call are part of those tables. And I hope that they can bring that experience that they've had in the Netherlands also to other countries and also to Canada. Back to you, Tom. Thanks,
Jaime. And those are both interesting examples on the industry, smart industry, clean industry. The building sector, I understand there's a lot of innovative stuff happening in the building sector. Would you mind sharing a little bit, these examples are great for us to learn from. Anything that we might be able to glean insights on the building sector for Canada?
Yeah, so the building sector, what we're looking at is alternative resources. So as you might know, cement is one of the heavy emitters, and that's both the production of cement, but also just the input of cement. The natural resources are already CO2 emitting as well. So it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to find a green premium on clean cement because you don't notice the difference. It's just cement to cement. If you drive an electric car, at least it's quiet. It looks cool. I mean, there's other things you buy besides that. It's just a different engine. So we're looking at other materials like wood and many other recyclable material to build. So that's one side that we're developing quite rapidly in the Netherlands, and our design sector is very well developed around this topic. Another one is green hydrogen, Toby. Green hydrogen. Everybody at Glasgow during the climate summit was talking about green hydrogen, and green hydrogen is kind of a proven technology, but hasn't been brought to scale yet. And in the Netherlands, we have a massive need of green hydrogen because we're phasing out of gas, so something needs to replace it. We've got very heavy industry that needs a lot of energy, and we need to produce it. And we're able to produce about 50% of it. So we're working with the industry, say in the port of Rotterdam or the port of Groningen in northern Netherlands, where there's heavy industry, to make a joint effort. But it's not just Dutch companies; it's really European and global companies working together to see how we can scale up production, storage, and transmission of hydrogen. And that's one side of the story. But on the import side, we're, I think, the country that has most MOUs around the world to see where can we get it cheaply of Northern Africa, so Morocco or Saudi Arabia or South Africa, Namibia, but also Chile, Uruguay. And I spoke to the Minister of Environment yesterday of Colombia and seeing if we can have an MOU with them as well for offtake of green hydrogen. But I signed also an MOU with Canada just after the climate top. I signed one with Canadian ambassador in the Netherlands to collaborate with Canada to create a market and to jointly focus on infrastructure. And we might be an off-taker of Canadian hydrogen going forward. So these are just examples of areas, and there's these solar, wind, circular economy, waste management, sustainable aviation fuels, as you said, bio-based buildings, climate smart agriculture. So there's so much in this field for the private sector to make a profit and to deliver a service to society. Back to you, Toby.
Thanks, Jaime. Yeah, and you didn't mention the beautiful Dutch electric bikes too. We'll be happy to do trade in those. We also have with us Jean-Marie Huddleston. She's the Director General of Bilateral Affairs and Trade with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Jean-Marie, can you help shed some light on some examples of collaborations that you're already witnessing between industry and the federal government when it comes to climate policy development in Canada? Because there's been a lot of development. This has been an issue that has really kind of ramped up, especially the last few years. Be really curious to hear about what's going on from you, because you've been right there in the middle of it.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Very much a pleasure to join this panel and this event, and my thanks to both the Embassy of the Kingdom of Netherlands and Corporate Knights for the invitation to share some perspectives on industry-government collaboration on climate policy in Canada. So as Her Excellency noted, increasing global urgency around the need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Canada, like many other countries, has really accelerated its efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including lasting a new 2030 target. And so we've built over the past 5 or so years a pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate with provinces and territories. And then in December of 2020, a new strengthened climate plan with over 60 new and expanded federal policies, programs, and investments to reduce emissions and build a more resilient economy. And so obviously achieving net zero emissions will require the support of all parts of our society. And as Government of Canada, across multiple federal departments and agencies, we engage actively and in an ongoing fashion as we're developing and implementing those climate policy measures. And certainly there's a quickly growing number of major Canadian companies that have announced their intent to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and many have been leaders in developing and producing low carbon goods and services. So as Government of Canada, we use a variety of mechanisms to engage and collaborate, including both multi-stakeholder and targeted engagement as we inform the development of policies and measures. So for example, that includes detailed technical discussions, publishing discussion papers regarding mitigation measures for a particular activity or sector, and of course, formal consultations through the publication of draft and final regulations. So the importance of this engagement, obviously, to ensure that our policies are being informed by a wide range of perspectives, including a solid understanding of industry realities, of emerging technologies, as well as the environmental and economic effects of climate measures on parts of the Canadian economy. And most recently, the government has been consulting on its 2030 emission reduction plan. So last June, the Government of Canada enshrined in law a commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050 through the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And that act requires the government to establish rolling 5-year emission targets, to develop plans to meet them, and to report regularly on progress. Of note, the act also established a net zero advisory body. So this is a group of diverse experts from across Canada that will engage Canadians across the spectrum, industry, civil society, academia, Canadians writ large, and then provide independent advice on the most likely pathways for Canada to achieve net zero and for its interim targets. And collaboration with partners and stakeholders is really fundamental to developing Canada's emission reduction plans, which is why the government launched an engagement process last December to inform the development of the new 2030 plan, which should be established by the end of next month. So looking ahead, the federal government is very much eager to partner with business to support this transition to net zero and to take advantage of all the new emerging opportunities as well. So for example, the Net Zero Challenge, which will be launched in the coming months, is a new voluntary initiative that aims to encourage businesses to develop and implement plans to transition their facilities and operations to net zero by 2050. And there's also a really important role for government and industry to work together to identify new skills that will be in demand or will grow in demand in future. So this is important for a just transition, which is supporting the upskilling and retraining of workers, increasing workforce participation by underrepresented groups, but overall also to ensure that we're growing the talent that we need for a thriving low carbon economy. And it's also apparent that the transition to a net zero economy will require substantial investment beyond the public sector, and private sector capital and expertise is going to be crucial to meeting those net zero objectives. And so that's why the federal government has taken some important steps to ensure the private sector is engaged. And notably, I'd highlight the Sustainable Finance Action Council, which was established in May of last year, which is intended to support the growth of a strong, well-functioning sustainable finance market here in Canada. And lastly, clean technology and innovation. I mean, this is an area where clearly continued collaboration is going to be key. And we know that many of the critical technologies needed to achieve net zero are only at early stage development today. And companies see those long-term trends and these emerging technologies in their sectors. And that information is so key to informing government policy and strategies. And I would point to a great collaborative example in this regard, which is the hydrogen strategy for Canada. So this strategy is meant to help focus activities and investments with respect to hydrogen, and was the culmination of more than 3 years of collaboration between the private sector, governments, Indigenous businesses and communities, NGOs, and academia. And that collaborative model is being continued through its implementation phase now. And as this event is being hosted by the Netherlands, I would also be remiss if I didn't emphasize how important that collaboration is between countries. So His Royal Highness mentioned the MOU between Canada and the Netherlands on hydrogen, but we also co-lead together with EU, Japan, and the US, the Clean Energy Ministerial Hydrogen Initiative. So that's another great example. So just in closing, to achieve near-term climate goals and reach net zero, we know that governments and businesses are going to need to work together ever more closely to ensure that the efforts of each of us is amplifying the work of the other. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and the discussion to follow. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jean-Marie. It'd be interesting to get your perspective. We've been looking at Canadian companies with export potential in the clean economy, and you can see that there's a huge potential for us to be a massive supplier of green metals that we're going to need for the electrification of the economy. A lot of people don't know that we have 12 of the 40 largest commercial landlords in the world domiciled in Canada because of our pension fund, some of our family enterprises that have built these huge global real estate investors, and all the property tech. And we have a lot of potential, beyond the green hydrogen and beyond the sustainable agriculture opportunities to export. And it seems like EDC, our Export Development Corporation, and some of our other enterprises like Sustainable Development Technology Canada and Business Development Bank of Canada and the private sector that you referenced with the Sustainable Finance Action Council are really sort of moving to mobilize finance for these types of activities. And it'd be really interesting to get your perspective on what you see is sort of potential opportunities for collaboration between government and the private sector, kind of to speed up the flow of capital so we can provide oxygen to these companies that have huge potential to export solutions and create prosperity at the same time.
So thanks for the question, Toby. I will try to address that. I will note this is not Environmental Climate Change Canada's area of specific expertise. But obviously that Sustainable Finance Action Council, really important first step. I would note that most recently their mandate was, say, kind of extended to seek their support on how we develop net zero capital allocation strategies, as well as a climate data strategy to ensure that the private sector and communities have access to data to inform, planning investments. But more broadly, as you mentioned, EDC, SDTC, but also Global Affairs Canada through its Trade Commissioner Service, really work to focus attention on attracting foreign direct investment to Canada and to create also opportunities for the export of Canadian technologies and sort of know-how overseas. And that's a fundamental part of their mandate. So.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So we have with us three business leaders, and none of them are pale, male, or stale. From these leading companies with Dutch-Canadian connections. We have with us Catherine Guimard-Diaz, who's the General Manager of Canada for Air France KLM, Susanna Pierce, who will be no stranger to many in the sustainability field in Canada, President and Country Chair, and the General Manager of Renewables and Energy Solutions for Shell Canada. And we also have Afifa Skonamio, the Director of North America Sales, Readiness, and Commercial Operations Liaison for Philips. So really appreciate you all joining us. And of course, we have with us John Dillon, who's had a bird's eye view of Canada's industrial policy for the last several decades and played a a fairly instrumental role in helping to shape those in his role as the Senior Vice President of Policy and Corporate Counsel for the Business Council of Canada. So we have a few questions. I'd be really curious to get your perspectives on in the order that had just introduced. The first question is, and for John, there'll be a slightly different version of this question, but first question for Catherine is, can you provide one or two concrete examples of low carbon initiatives or investments that your company has helped to implement and reap some benefits from?
Yeah, sure. And good afternoon, good morning, everyone. And I'm really happy to be with you today. And thank you to Ines and Sebastian of the Netherlands and Corporate Knights for this opportunity. It's also great to see many women around this panel. So I'm really happy to be with you today. So like you mentioned, green transition is really part of the DNA of KLM since many years. We have a very strong sustainability roadmap. We launched in 2019 what we call Fly Responsibly. And basically, it encompasses all the action KLM is taking towards sustainable aviation. And it's based on three key pillars for us: reduce, replace, and compensate. We are one of the company leading to net zero by 2050, like it was mentioned in this panel before. So we have a very strong roadmap to be able to reach this target. Also to mention that you mentioned climate change urgency, but our roadmap actually encompasses not only environmental goals, but also economy and society. It's really key, and especially representing KLM. KLM is serving definitely society, economic activity, economic growth, and it's also one of the largest employers in the Netherlands. So definitely, it's also this roadmap encompasses this social impact as well we are having in the society. Just to give you an example of few initiatives, definitely we have two main levers today. And the first one is definitely fleet renewal, how we are basically investing massively to renovate our fleet and to work with more sustainable aircraft. We have a strong investment plan for medium haul and long haul to renew our fleets. For example, for European flights with a new Airbus 320 and 31, aiming to reduce significantly fuel consumption. But also for long haul, we have also a strong investment with a new generation aircraft like the Boeing Dreamliner. That allow us to reduce significantly fuel consumption. The second pillar, and it also has been mentioned by Jaime and Jean-Marie, it's definitely innovation and smart technology. And one of them is how we can leverage the usage of sustainable fuel. KLM has been investing a lot in that field for more than 10 years, actually. We have been doing our first sustainable fuel using biofuel in 2011. More recently, last year we did a long haul flight using synthetic kerosene. So it's a new technology that we managed through our partnership with Shell in the Netherlands. So we are definitely strongly investing in that field, and it's really key because we know that the green aircraft is not for tomorrow, especially looking at long haul. So we really need also to collaborate more in that field, especially sustainable fuel. So this is part of our commitment, but also to mention that we are not alone. It's a full value chain, and also our customers are part of this journey. So we have also a dedicated program for our customer to be able also to invest, for example, in sustainable fuel for corporate clients. But also for B2C clients, we have also a voluntary program to be able to buy also sustainable fuel if the customer wants to participate in this room.
Thanks, Catherine. That's really nice overview, and it's nice to see the sustainable aviation fuels picking up. It seems like electrification is going to proceed. It's already proceeding quite quickly in the passenger vehicle place, and it seems like those potential on the freight, the aviation will probably come after marine in terms of electrification, and not for long haul in the foreseeable. So nice to see the aviation, sustainable aviation fuels. Seems like that's a big part of the solution in the sort of medium term to potential near term. And you mentioned the collaboration with Shell, and Susanna is familiar with this. Susanna, you have an interesting role in that you're heading up Shell Canada and also renewables at the same time. So it's not off in the corner in the blue box. It's in the CEO and the president's suite, which is nice to see. And know that you care passionately about the climate issue from your work and history in it. So it'd be really interesting to get your sense of one or two examples of where the dial is being moved, and what we can take away from that as insights.
Yeah, thanks, Toby, and thank you, Ambassador, Your Royal Highness, and for putting this on. I think it's a great opportunity to have a good discussion. And I love what Catherine was saying. If I just keep with what she was talking about in terms of what we say as our Scope 3 emissions for Shell, they're the emissions of our customers. If we really want to see change in our customers' emissions, we need to work with them. And what Catherine was describing was a perfect example of where we came together and we said, okay, we as Shell have a commitment to get to net zero, which includes our Scope 1 emissions, Scope 2, Scope 3. So Scope 1, the emissions that we create when we produce energy. Scope 2, the emissions that we cause to be created because we use that as part of our production of energy. So that could be steam, it could be electricity. And Scope 3, which what Catherine was describing, are, for example, air emissions. And so sustainable aviation fuel is a great example of where we work together and say, how do we make this happen? Sustainable aviation fuel, too, the challenge that we've got, for our customers, is also very expensive and the supply is not available. So we need to be able to work back from the customers to help solve that problem. Solving our customers' problems also helps solve our problems, which is our commitment to get to net zero across Scope 1, 2, and 3. And I would just say, I think for everyone, when we talk about net zero, not all net zeros are the same. We really need to understand what that means. Because for some companies, they may not be thinking about Scope 3. They might be thinking about just the emissions that I create. Okay, so when I drive a car, assuming I drive a car that's not electric, I'm creating my Scope 1 emissions. So again, it's really important, I think, as a level set. Let's really understand where the emissions are coming from. That's what we are doing at Shell, because we have a very clear commitment to achieving net zero. Very clear commitment doesn't mean it's an easy one. And I think obviously we have a lot of folks from the Netherlands. You understand that there is added urgency with respect to a court decision that came out, which increases, our attention on our actions. And so when it comes down to the Canadian context that I'm responsible for, I do look at it from the perspective of staying with a strategy, which is the Shell strategy, which sits in sort of 4 buckets, which is making sure that we're generating revenues to our shareholders, because in the absence of revenues, we actually don't have investment capital to make decisions and investments. Achieving net zero, which I already talked about. What Catherine was saying too, powering lives, that's really the aspect of what I like to call shared prosperity, diversity, inclusion, making sure we're paying attention to a just transition, and then respecting nature. That's the 4th part of our strategy, which is really all about how do we recognize the circular economy, how do we reduce impacts on nature, reduce water use, etc. And so in the Canadian context, that's the strategy I'm trying to execute. And it's interesting, Toby, because my portfolio on renewables and energy solutions is pretty much all tied up into what I think about as far as the Canadian business. So in Canada, as for those of you familiar with what we have everything from upgrading, refining, and chemicals product manufacturing, primarily focused in Sarnia as well as in Edmonton, Alberta. We have all those retail stations that you see when you drive around. We have a variety of other things, such as terminals that distribute the fuels. And then we have some great new investments, which again, if I break down into Scope 1, 2, and 3, I can describe in answer to your question, Toby, that can actually see where it's becoming real. So let's talk about Scope 1. Scope 1, a really good example of what we have done and what we are doing is carbon capture sequestration. So a few years back, we started a project called Quest. It was a pilot project. which means that we were testing out the technology. It was a public-private partnership in order to show what can we do to capture emissions from our upgrader unit at Scotford. And the upgrader, for those that aren't familiar with what that means, that's essentially it takes bitumen, changes it into crude, which then eventually will become all those fuels which we use. Jet fuel, it'll become kerosene, all those products. So at the upgrader, we basically used this project called Quest. To date, since it started, it's captured 6 million tons. Okay. For those that have heard about Quest, the important part is it was a pilot to show that it worked. In addition to show that it worked, it actually helped to demonstrate what are the regulations and what are some of the enabling policies to make something like this happen. A lot of good learnings that came from Quest. We're now moving forward with a second project, which will become a hub, which will not only capture our emissions from our refinery and chemicals plant, but it will also capture the emissions of others. So this is getting to from 1 million tons a year up to 10 million tons a year. So that's scope 1, but it's also emissions from others. If I look at scope 2, now scope 2 are the emissions that we cause to be created when we do things, when we produce the energy, whether it's low carbon fuels or et cetera. We don't have a lot of deregulation in Canada. So when I talk about renewable power, I'm somewhat limited to where I can go. I can go in Alberta. Alberta's, from that perspective, as a deregulated province, I can actually begin to build independent power projects. So we're looking at 2 initially, well, more than 2 actually, but the ones that I can talk about is a solar project and a wind project. By investing in these projects, again, we're reducing our scope 2 emissions with the commitment to, again, get to half by 2030. Now, finally, scope 3, I've talked a little bit about partnerships with end users. A really interesting project that I'm kind of excited about because it's at a different stage of technology development is a project called Varennes. And the Varennes project is in Quebec. And this is working with Enercom technology. And so this is a shell investment to advance and build up a new technology that is waste to energy. So we're actually investing in this technology in a project in Quebec so that we can eventually have 125 million liters of low carbon fuels, which again are helping to build up a technology. It's a waste to energy project. And that's another one that I'm quite excited about because it shows that we are moving not only our own emissions, but through strategic investments, we're actually building up new technologies and then beginning to understand what are the enabling policies and regulations, which, Toby, to your point, which I'm also quite passionate about, what can we use here in Canada to then leverage as an export? I'm so on top of that. You know, I think we have so many great opportunities to show what we can do here, which then not only becomes an export of the technology, it's an export of also the regulations and the policies to make these things happen.
What would you say, I'm really curious about the export piece. What would you say are top 3 biggest opportunities, like top 3, just off the top of your head?
Well, I think, you know, on the top of my head, I mean, in a Canadian context, if I think about what we are doing well, I mean, carbon capture sequestration, I think is a good example. When we look at Canada, for example, from the Shell perspective, we're considered kind of a mature area. We talked about hydrogen a little bit earlier. I think one of the great aspects for Canada, and you know, this is also in other parts of the world, but we have a lot of renewable power. So from a green hydrogen perspective, presuming we can get that renewable power as affordable as possible, because it's a very important input, we have an opportunity to leverage that expertise. Although I would say that other parts of the world are maybe more advanced, for example, in Europe and California, but we're moving forward on some of that. Also, another type of what we call hydrogen is blue. I like what Minister Wilkinson of Enercon says, we shouldn't be calling it colors, we should be calling it carbon intensity, that matters. Blue hydrogen is also quite exciting because where you can use carbon capture sequestration, you can reduce the carbon intensity, and then that hydrogen becomes that lower carbon fuel, which again, for harder to electrify and abate sectors such as heavy duty trucking, aviation and time, locomotives, for example, there's great opportunity there, and marine. So that could be something that we also look at. You know, I have to say this, even though that we're not investing in it, is we have small modular nuclear reactors. And I do think that that's a really interesting and exciting opportunity, even though as Shell, we're not currently involved in that, but I think that's something that we should be looking to leverage. And
you didn't mention LNG in there though.
Well, LNG is as an export. So a liquefied natural gas as an export where economies need it as an alternative to more carbon intensive sources of energy, which again, if we think about it today, where you do not have the capacity for renewable power. And I think we've seen where there's some intermittency issues or we're not yet at scale. If natural gas is more affordable than coal, then it is a better product because it's less carbon intensive. I also believe that when we think about LNG, we will begin to see more and more that end users have a choice of where they procure their LNG. So is it going to be lower carbon LNG or is it going to be higher carbon intensive LNG. So those are some of the criteria that I think over time end users are going to make some decisions about.
Interesting. And just quickly on the LNG part, there seems to be some debate about the life cycle carbon intensity, just given the methane leaks. If you have a 3% or so methane leaks from the, along the supply chain, it can offset the carbon intensity reductions. Is there, I mean, you've obviously looked at this from a science-based perspective. Yeah. What kind of credence do you give to that? Because it seems like it's pretty solid analysis using satellite readings and things like that, showing the sort of methane emissions.
I do think that with technology today, we will be able to demonstrate, what is the carbon intensity on a life cycle basis from production all the way through distribution, liquefaction, shipping, and then consumption. So I actually think that's going to become, it's an important consideration, but I think we'll be able to demonstrate what is the life cycle of each of these projects over time. And I think even with responsibly sourced gas, blockchain, we'll be able to actually really be clear about where those molecules are coming from. I agree 100% though, methane is an issue. We do need to tackle it. And I think Jean-Marie would probably highlight that in Canada, we do actually have some pretty important methane emissions reduction commitments. So 75%, that's no small feat, but we as companies really need to make sure that we're demonstrating that. So Toby, I'm in alignment with you. We can't get away with actually sending out a product that can be lower carbon and demonstrating that through technology.
Okay, thanks, Susanna. Afifa, joining us from Philips, be really curious if you could share with us a couple of examples where Philips is with the dial on carbon emissions.
Certainly, Toby, and first I'd like to thank Corporate Knights as well as the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands for putting together this panel, and also to my co-panelists for their ongoing efforts around sustainability and passion. And so to start with a little bit of context to anchor my remarks, the healthcare sector is responsible for 4% of global CO2 emissions. And so Philips, as a purpose-driven organization, is very conscious of its responsibility towards society and the need to further embed sustainability ever deeper into its way of doing business. And so proud to say that Philips has been carbon neutral in its operations since 2020 and has continued to build on that success by investing in renewable energy, such as multiple wind farms across the world, intended to power all of its non-industrial sites by 2023. And as a point of emphasis, this was achieved not in silo, but through much needed cross-industry partnerships with the likes of Google, Heineken, DSM, and Nouryon. And to touch on a second example of a low carbon initiative, Philips has also been performing life cycle assessments, which provide insights into the environmental impact of our products from cradle to grave. And this cuts across the entire continuum from the supply chain phase, manufacturing phase, customer use phase, as well as the disposal phase. And these insights are in turn used to steer our eco-design efforts. And what it is it encompasses factors such as product design, a focus on energy efficiency, the packaging, the substances that we use, as well as circularity. And this is a significant investment in a low carbon future, as the customer use phase of our product accounts for 80% of our environmental impact. And so eco-design very intentionally is guided towards minimizing this. And so in terms of targets, or what that means in terms of action plans for Philips, Philips has set a target of 100% of its new product introductions to meet eco-design requirements by 2025. And so to wrap up, these life cycle assessments specifically have allowed us to quantifiably measure as well the environmental impact that our products have on society at large through an environmental profit and loss account, or an EPNL, which is published annually and really captures the hidden environmental costs of doing business as a whole. And so in essence, as part of Philips's commitment in achieving a low carbon economy, we've taken action to really rethink our business model and to decouple our economic growth from the impact that we have on the environment.
Thanks, Afifa. It's interesting when I think of the healthcare sector, don't think of it as a major emitter, but as you point out, 4% of global emissions, that's kind of almost on par with aviation in the same kind of ballpark. And Philips is leading the way in so many ways here. But how is a consumer or a buyer able to discern, whether or not a medical product is low carbon? There's not a sort of like an organic or fair trade or an energy guide label that goes on. Are there any kind of emerging standards, or Philips creating something so that people can kind of get a sense of how do you differentiate the climate friendliness of a medical product?
Current state, we don't label for these types of initiatives, but this is absolutely an area of focus globally to partner with governments in rolling out that type of program so that our investors, our customers know what they are purchasing and how they're contributing to sustainability as a whole.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Afifa. And John, great to see you again. It would be interesting to get your perspective on sort of larger trends that you're seeing in terms of the potential to move the carbon dial. But just before that, you've been watching this file for, as you said in our sort of pre-call, your whole career, climate file, and be really curious to get your perspective on how it's changed in terms of, issues are usually seen as, either a sword issue or a shield issue. The shield issue is, something you want to defend yourself against. The sword one is something that is an offense opportunity to go out and venture forth. Have you seen an evolution in terms of the climate file for Canadian business on this sword shield spectrum over your career?
Absolutely, Toby. Let me just start by offering my thanks as well to the Embassy of the Netherlands and the Corporate Knights, and you, Toby, for organizing this. Yeah, absolutely. That trend has been very evident. I was going to talk a little bit about that in terms of what some of our sectors are doing, but clearly we've moved from a state where there was a great deal of debate about climate policy and targets, and it seems at times kind of an incessant focus on targets, to where I think everyone is much more focused now on action, what that action looks like. And we've seen a considerable shift in the business community in two respects. One is obviously setting targets and putting plans in place, but also I think I don't want to say moving ahead of governments, but they're moving in some respects almost irrespective of policy. And now the question is more about, can you provide some policy certainty? We're no longer debating about whether we need a climate policy. It's, can you give me some clarity and certainty over the longer term? Because I have billions of dollars at stake here and many investments that will last 20, 30, and 40 years. So I want to make, companies want to make sure they're making the right investments that will pay off both in terms of their economic performance, but also their environmental performance. And one of the areas where we've seen that shift is clearly in the financial sector. And that was one of the mega trends, if you want to call it that, that I was going to talk a little bit about in the time that I have on this first question. Because, we just seen obviously last week the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board set a net zero target, one of several pension funds that have moved in that direction, and signals about how they're shifting their portfolio. We've seen all of our major banks step forward, and I've lost track actually of what the sum total is, but they're committing hundreds of billions of dollars, as you know, to sustainable finance, and thinking about how they can help finance some of these opportunities, how they can work with their customers and their clients that they're financing and investing in helping them figure out the transition. And also, frankly, huge pools of private capital that are looking for opportunities to find revenue generating projects that are low carbon. So there's a huge shift in terms of how the financial community is looking at this. Another one I wanted to touch on briefly is our energy sector, in particular the oil sands. Obviously, that's a huge component of our emissions profile, but also of our economy. So we have the six largest, or the six companies that represent 95% of oil sands production have also committed to net zero, and they're really thinking about how they can reduce their emissions across their operations. A big focus of that, as we've already talked about and Susanna mentioned, is carbon capture and storage. And that's another trend that's very significant, and a lot of companies are paying attention to, and not just in the energy sector, although that's critical for sure. But we're seeing companies make announcements almost every week, new proposals for carbon capture projects, usually in the billions of dollars, usually in the millions of tons of potential GHG emissions reductions. And really focused not just on the capture itself, although that is important, but focused also on the infrastructure that's going to support that. Susanna mentioned her Polaris project. So how can we get more of these companies working together? Because we obviously have a lot of different sites and different sectors that are producing emissions, but there's huge opportunity. And of course, not just to store the carbon, but also to utilize it and make it into useful products. So that's another significant trend. Clearly, what's happening in terms of the electricity system, in particular, the electrification of transportation is a huge trend in Canada. Partly because, of course, we've always been strong in the production of automobiles and auto parts, but we're also seeing movement in other aspects of the transport sector. There was a little talk earlier about sustainable aviation fuel. We have a number of companies investing in and examining sustainable aviation fuel. We have companies looking at hydrogen for heavy trucks, and one of our railways is experimenting with a hydrogen locomotive. So a great deal of work in terms of that. But the biggest component, I think, in Canada, for obvious reasons, is the move towards electric vehicles, particularly in the passenger and light duty truck field. The major North American manufacturers have all made commitments to invest in electric vehicle production in Canada. And the other really important component of that for the Canadian economy is our ability to tap into our supply of critical minerals. The platinum, cobalt, zinc, copper, the other critical minerals that are essential, not just for electric batteries, although that's a big component of it, obviously, but even for things like smartphones and computers and some of our electronics. So huge opportunities there. We have the stores, we have the assets in many cases, but we really need to think about how we can capitalize on those opportunities. And just a couple of other things quickly. Toby, you mentioned earlier low carbon minerals and metals, and that's a huge opportunity for Canada. Obviously, we have that demonstration plant that's being built in Quebec right now that's going to develop a zero emissions aluminum smelter, which is a huge important development for the aluminum industry, not just in Canada, but internationally. Our steel companies are investing in new technologies to make them amongst the lowest carbon steel producers anywhere in the world, and there's other examples of that as well. And then just finally, and I think you touched on this as well, Toby, the work that's going on in our agricultural sector is critically important. I mean, we sometimes think of ourselves as a huge agricultural producer for the world, and we certainly are. But what's really interesting, I think, is what's happening in terms of the new agricultural technologies, many of which are being developed here in Canada, that both help retain carbon in soils, which is critical in fighting climate change, but also improve the soil quality, so we get better agricultural yields, and it actually help the farmers in terms of lowering their costs by lowering their need for things like pesticides and fertilizer. So, and that's really just scratching the surface of some of the things that are happening across the Canadian private sector, Toby, but I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, John. That was a really good tour, and really interesting, just the point about the finance starting to drive things. I think globally we're up to $130 trillion of financial institutions committed to net zero. And you mentioned CPP, our national pension fund. The top 3 pension funds now in Canada all have net zero commitments, and collectively they control over $1 trillion Canadian dollars in assets. So pretty significant. Nice to see our big institutions stepping up. And you talked about the work the Business Council has done around the need for a clean industrial policy in Canada. to really get more intentional to make sure we keep pace with the change that's happening in the real world, and the fact that market forces alone are going to move too slow if we don't grab the bull by the horns. But one thing I wonder about is having the incumbents input on policy is always helpful. But I think about one of the greatest success stories of Canadian growth, economic growth of the last half century has to be the oil sands. And the way that came together was in direct opposition to what the incumbents were calling for. At the time, the oil and gas companies kind of laughed at the Sun Company as an alternative energy. I think they wouldn't even let them into the petroleum club, to get a beer or whatever. They kind of made fun of them. And then fast forward, of course, hundreds of billions of dollars in massive industry, all sorts of jobs and tax revenue. And it happened because there was leadership to sort of see the economic potential in spite of what the incumbents were calling for. And I wonder, in your position, you see all sorts of things, but what do you think we might be missing that's not currently on the kind of front view mirror in terms of huge opportunities for Canadian industry to be part of the solution for the mega trends of the future on the low carbon transition? Before the oil sands were a huge part of the energy equation. What's going to be the oil sands of the next 30 years that the incumbents aren't looking at right now?
That's a little harder for me to say because I don't have the best crystal ball when it comes to predicting future trends, Toby. But your oil sands example is an interesting one because, as you know, that was a case of turning an uneconomic asset into an economic one through technology and through collaboration between the private and public sectors. I don't know the whole history of that, but clearly it was a collaboration in terms of both the R&D that produced it, but also the designing the policy tax and other policies that would support it and help it become economic. But I think what we've talked about in some of our work at the Business Council is thinking about, as you said, a more intentional industrial policy that focuses on where some of those key opportunities are. And I think some of them are in clean tech. And again, I don't want to point fingers at sort of single out any particular company, but I don't think Canadians fully appreciate how much innovation there is happening. Yes, in the larger companies, but also in some of the small tech, clean tech startups. And we've said for the longest time at the Business Council, we should be about growing Canadian champions. We're a small trade-dependent economy. Our real success comes from a lot of those companies that are able to grow to scale and export around the world. And too often, sometimes, some of our really interesting technology companies end up being bought out by bigger wallets in other countries. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to think about what's an intentional industrial policy to grow some of those clean tech champions. And I think that's something that certainly at the Business Council, we want to spend some time on. The so-called CARPA, the Canada Advanced Research Projects Agencies that the federal government has proposed, which is modeled on DARPA in the US, for some people may be familiar with. We think that's a real opportunity to really do something different, be intentional about it, and think differently about how we not just create new technology, but also build it to scale and commercialize it. So it really is an opportunity for us. So we're hopeful that an agency like CARPA will take off and be successful in that realm.
That's interesting. I didn't know about that. That's thanks, John. Okay, moving on to question 2. This is, so I apologize for the follow-ups, but I'm just curious and learning a lot here. We have a lot of Q&A questions as well. But moving to question 2, and go back to you, Catherine. What are the biggest challenges? You talked about the different things, the sustainable aviation, biofuels. There's questions here about when will we see electric flights becoming the norm for short haul. What are the biggest challenges that your company faces as you try to sort of align aviation with a net zero world?
Yeah, well, it has been mentioned by some of the panelists. Jaime was mentioning the key question: how to scale up production, and it's really by far the biggest challenge for us. Today, the production is very minimal. We are still dealing with experimental flight, but there is a huge potential. We were mentioning smart technologies, clean technologies. So it's not only an effort like just for us airline. It's a full industry effort, because we need innovation, investment in research and development. And for us, the key question is to, as I mentioned, the access to a sustainable fuel, and also a way to reduce the premium, because today the premium price is quite significant. And if we are looking at really replacing jet fuel by sustainable fuel, we really need to scale up the production. So it was mentioned before. So we are dealing about collaboration at research and development, innovation, also collaboration with policymakers. So it's really the full value chain you are looking at. So that's why we are really pushing these efforts. In Canada, we are looking at doing an experimental flight with KLM in May between Amsterdam and Edmonton. And we want to look at the full value chain. So not only at sustainable fuel, but basically taking the full journey of an aircraft, looking at what we can do basically on each pillar of the journey to have really looking at the full value chain. So it's really key for us to collaborate with the industry and with policymakers to make this happening. And it was mentioned before, you have a huge potential for this, and especially in Canada. Looking at hydrogen, water, wind power energy, you have the potential, but really today, the production is not there.
Okay, that's helpful. Sort of outlining some of those challenges. Susanna, there's I guess there's a lot of challenges because in your job, you're right at the nexus of sort of the energy economy of the last century and the one coming up in the next century as well, and the in-between piece. What are the biggest challenges that you see that need to be overcome to move more quickly on the decarbonization front?
Thanks, Toby. Maybe I'll keep with the aviation story, simply because I think it's a good articulation of the challenge. And by the way, I'm not an expert in aviation, but I'm going to do my best just to describe the challenge of shifting from the jet fuel production into sustainable aviation fuel production, because I think it can articulate a little bit better what we're challenged with. So right now, the majority of airlines, of course, use jet fuel. And so we have created a value chain, as Catherine was saying, to create the jet fuel. We have to change all of that from where the feedstock comes from, whether it comes from crude all the way through to jet fuel, to something that is renewable. So agricultural residues, landfill waste, and all the rest of it. We've now got to change the feedstock, okay? And then you need to change a little bit of the kit that processes that feedstock into the sustainable aviation fuel. And then you've got to get to the airlines. You also have to have the airplanes that can essentially consume all of that sustainable aviation fuel to 100%. So just as an example, that full value chain needs to be adjusted. All of that takes time and capital investment. And as Catherine was saying, like, sustainable aviation fuel now is much more expensive. There's a premium. So how do you get the airlines to commit to do that? Well, how do I commit as a company to commit to produce it unless they agree to pay for it? So we've got this relationship. And I think that relationship is something where, again, when we think about the business that we've created over 100 years producing energy for customers, now we have to be very close to our customers and how they are moving to decarbonize. So we create all of that value chain with others along the way. Now, how do we accelerate that? Now, how do we make sure that we can address this? Because we have some pretty clear climate targets that need to be met, some pretty aggressive climate targets by 2030. What do we do? This is where it comes down to public-private partnerships. This is where it comes down to enabling policy. This is where it comes down in conversations with Catherine and saying, okay, KLM, what do you need? Okay, Shell, what do you need? How do we surgically create the enabling environment, create the markets, so that Shell, you have the incentive to produce, and that Catherine, You have the incentive to buy that fuel because you've got the airplanes ready to go. It's our challenge. And it's the speed by which that can change, is the speed by which we can change our business. And it's a tightrope because, again, like, we recognize that we've made our commitments public, and we have a court ruling behind that too. So we are very committed to doing that. But again, the challenge you have in the private sector, and the private sector is, by the way, not the enemy. I need to say that right out, right? Because the private sector is what you and I put our money into to make a return, you know, and it's what CPPIB does too. It's pensioners' money. And so you can't expect the private sector to put money into bad investments, then we're losing your money. So the thing that we have to be thoughtful of, and the thing that KLM needs to be thoughtful of, is how are we making the right investment decisions while also accelerating decarbonization that today may not be economic for all those reasons I just described. Again, that is where we have to really take a look at what's the role of the public sector, what is the role of the private sector. The good news is that, like never before, we are seeing companies, private sector, and governments coming together and saying, we agree, we need to do something. And we can talk about how many have made net zero commitments, all the rest of it. That hasn't happened until really over the last 2 years, where, for example, Shell, I'll use the hydrogen as an example. I'm in Vancouver. We've had 2 hydrogen refueling stations here for a few years. Great news, good stuff. Nobody's driving hydrogen cars. So the problem is we can produce the hydrogen, but if you're not driving the hydrogen cars, then you've got a problem. So again, we're now seeing, though, the customers are investing in the technology because either they've run out of the old technology, it's now expired and they want a new car, or there are now incentives such as zero emissions vehicles mandates that are actually making it more economic for me to buy that hydrogen car or that EV. So again, all these things are happening. That's really good news. When I wake up every day, I do think about how do we bring these consortiums together? Who needs to be in the room? How do we help government understand that? That's really my day job. And again, it's really working across each of those ecosystems, mindful of the challenges of getting everything to a place where the capacity can grow and they can all become economic.
Okay, that's helpful. On the aviation side, there is talk, and I imagine you've maybe been approached about this already. The federal government is interested in creating kind of a buyer's club where Department of National Defense, Air Canada, federal government come together and say, we're going to buy X billion liters, put it as a tender, and sort of, you know, there'll be a bit of a premium, prime the pump, create the demand. Just like to get your, so that's a carrot. Like to get both of your enthusiasm meters on that. Is that on the enthusiasm meter, are you sort of, is that a 0 to 10? Is that a 10, or does that make a lot of sense, or?
I mean, Catherine, do you want to go first? You do save your 0 to 10.
Yeah, no, it does. But like I mentioned today, the main challenge for us, especially in Canada, is like the offer is not yet ready. So you have some pilots and some, but like really to be able to scale up the production, it's not there yet. So that's why we really need to push this. And when you look around the world, worldwide, the production today is very minimal. And like Susanna was mentioning, it's a full transition of the value chain. It's like we are the buyer, we need the producer, we need the policymaker on board. So you see, like it's a full chain, and so the commitment is there definitely. But today, really, we need to scale up the production and to reduce the premium, and we are not yet there yet. Yeah, not yet.
Yeah, so I think again, like what Catherine is saying, I think having off-take agreements like that make a heck of a lot of sense. Excuse me. And I think the thing that we've got here is if the public sector is going to purchase the planes. By the way, again, because planes as airlines themselves, not airlines, but planes are actually limited by how much they can consume. That technology component. And then the actual fuel, that's a couple of pieces of the value chain that are important. But I think what Catherine is highlighting, which again is the other piece we need to keep in mind, is it's also the feedstock and the collection of the feedstock and the processing. We probably have more demand for sustainable aviation fuel than we have the ability to produce it. So we also have to think about, in this circumstance, the production and the feedstock end and how that all fits together. But Toby, I think the role of governments is very important in terms of providing that customer that may or may not be there already, committing to an agreement to purchase potentially at a premium. as long as though those other pieces of value chain are addressed as part of it.
Okay, that's helpful. And then in terms of the stick piece, do you, given the urgency, if it's done in a fair way, do you both think it makes sense to apply an aggressive carbon tax? Is Canada is planning on doing sort of to the aviation sector to kind of do this at the same time, create a carrot stick, and then give a big incentive for folks to move?
I will just say from a policy and enabling environment, and Catherine, you can speak to aviation because I don't want to speak for you on that, but I think the two do need to go hand in hand together, essentially because one of the things the private sector looks towards is some degree of regulatory certainty. And so, for example, carbon capture sequestration, good example of that is we now see carbon prices going to 170. We see the potential for clean fuels standard coming in for credit generation. That is helpful. It may not be enough, however, and is not enough to get us to a point of investment decision because those two things are insufficient. So that is where the carrot comes in. Again, on a basis of where you're not making an economic investment decision and you want to accelerate it, the carrot and a stick working hand in hand together, given the timelines that we're talking about, are, I think, an important combination. Catherine, you can speak to aviation specifically.
No, exactly. It's exactly what you mentioned, and Susanna. And in Europe, you have already mandates like to integrate sustainable fuel, also to accelerate the transition. And so it's, and like Susanna mentioned, it's key to collaborate on this, and it's a combination of both. You need collaboration with policymaker, investments, and to look at the full chain. But definitely it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. Afifa, what are some of the key challenges that kind of keep you up at night? Hopefully not too late. I hope you're getting a good night's sleep, but that you think about anyways when you're going to bed. And what can we do to overcome them?
It was great listening to both Susanna and Catherine's insights, which points to some common industry or cross-industry challenges. And so to delineate, I'll focus specifically on the health tech sector. And so I think within the health tech sector, we need to continue to challenge ourselves, not just with the lens of low carbon solutions at the manufacturing or operational level, but as both Catherine and Susanna said, expand this across the full value chain, which can often be where most of the impact lies. And to emphasize, this is no easy feat and may require rebuilding foundational parts of how an organization operates. And this requires significant investment and partnership. And at this time, although great strides have been made both within Canada and across the world, market regulations and trade policies have yet to be optimized to create a favorable environment to allow circularity to scale up. And this specifically is a challenge or can be seen as a challenge for many companies in adopting low carbon solutions. This is where lawmakers play an important role by creating the ecosystem for circular business models to succeed over the linear business models. And a good example of this is while Philips's circular revenues amounted to over 15% in 2021, to further scale up from there in the current environment can be a challenge. And so while things like trade policies can embed circularity across the global value chain, public procurement specifically is an efficient tool in pushing for circular solutions at a national level here in Canada. And what I mean by that is the public sector has the power to direct the use of funds from those linear-based products and services to the circular ones, for example, by setting clear minimum criteria on the materials used, the life cycle of the products procured, or even using product as a service over purchases where possible. And again, as a point of emphasis, we have seen traction on all these fronts to a degree, but ultimately there is further opportunity to leverage these practices and really drive that cross-industry shift that we need in areas where at this time can be a challenge for organizations to continue to scale up and drive their low carbon initiatives and solutions.
Thanks, Viva. That's helpful. And maybe just for me, maybe others would be helpful too. Because you talked about some really interesting notions that Philips is on the cutting edge of in terms of the environmental profit and loss accounts and recording the % of your sales that align with circular economy. Can you just sort of maybe explain? Some people might say, well, what do you mean circular economy sales? What does that mean? And I know you guys have a pretty rigorous definition there, but could you just maybe just share briefly what circular economy, 15% of sales being circular economy means?
Certainly, there's different ways to really capture value across the life cycle, the least of which is through recycling, but really by taking further measures and maintaining that value across the product life cycle. That's where Philips is really looking at the end-to-end from the supply chain phase, manufacturing phase, and even things like the customer use phase, for example, where we are spending most of our environmental impact. And that's where we're tying it all off by capturing where the hotspots lie through the life cycle assessments that I mentioned earlier, and quantifying specifically within the EP&L how year over year Philips is driving traction on reducing its overall environmental impact. And so that circular economy is ensuring there is no waste on the entirety of the continuum. And we have made great strides looking back since its implementation in 2017, all the way to now, although the 2021 EP&L is soon to be published, but not yet published.
Thanks, that's helpful. John, the Business Council has been focused. You've been working with the members. I listened to you guys. If anybody wants to catch a great event, there's a Canadian Club event Business Council Canada did that includes Don Lindsay, who's the outgoing chair, and a panel that includes Susanna, and talks about some of the opportunities presented in Canada. So I know, John, you've been thinking about the challenges and how to for Canada to win these to place on the podium of the low carbon sweepstakes, given its seminal importance now to our economic prosperity. And I'd be really curious about what you see as the key challenges and ideas to overcome them, in a sort of urgent manner.
Sure, I'll touch on three. Try and be quick, Toby. Firstly, I think we need a strong investment environment for Canadian investment. We've just gone through a very tough 2 years, obviously, with the pandemic and everything that's happened. So, we're seeing some capital available within companies and through private equity and so on. We really need to focus on what the positive investment environment will be to stimulate that development. As an example, we're waiting to see what the investment tax credit will look like for carbon capture and storage. That will go a long way to unlocking a lot of the potential in CCS. Second, and related to that, is we really need to think more about long-term policy clarity and consistency. Something that goes beyond election cycles. I mean, as I said earlier, a lot of the big emissions reduction projects are very capital intensive, and they're investments that will last 20, 30, and 40 years. So companies really need to understand what the policy environment is going to look like going forward, and not just till the next election, but further than that. So it's not an easy ask, but it's absolutely essential. And the third thing I would emphasize is building up our electricity grid. I talked earlier about electric vehicles. We're seeing other applications for, as has been said several times already, we do have a low carbon electricity grid in Canada. We can expand that, but I've seen estimates of at least double and possibly triple our electricity capacity in Canada in order to meet the net zero target, with industrial applications of electricity, with electric vehicles, with, proposals to do more heating and cooling of buildings through electricity. So we really need to think about how we're going to build that, frankly, how we're going to get better cooperation across provinces in building the electricity transmission grid, and frankly, how we're going to build them more quickly and get approval processes that are more cost effective, because again, electricity production and transmission is big capital intensive projects as well, and some of the transmission goes long distances, so we need to figure out those issues so we can get that all in place relatively quickly, because 2030, we have a very ambitious target for 2030. It's only 8 years away.
Yeah, those three things kind of pop out. Quick follow-ups on each. So the first one, it seems like there's a lot of emphasis. A few years ago, the oil sector, led by Suncor's CEO, was putting a lot of emphasis on the potential of carbon fibers. A lot of people don't know this, but Canada has the largest supply of asphaltene in the world. Bitumen is 17% asphaltene, and we have not much R&D has gone into it, but there's people who work closely with this in Alberta. They think a little bit of money and a few years, you could crack the nut and figure out how to get carbon fiber out of the bitumen at a pretty competitive price, which the Suncor CEO said in an op-ed a couple of years ago could unlock an economic opportunity on par with the oil sands, or even substantially larger, in the sort of 100 billion a year kind of range. But it's more in that sort of potential, and in some ways, carbon capture and storage. Susanna said we have a relatively mature market in Canada. That's because it's relatively immature everywhere else. It's a pretty nascent thing. But just wondering if you think we should be placing, if we're placing bets on things that are somewhat nascent, like carbon capture and storage, if we should also be placing bets on things that could be big home runs, like the carbon fiber, in terms of the R&D that needs to be plowed into that.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we will have to place some bets in this country. We can't do everything. We have some obvious strengths based on our resources and our expertise. That's one of the reasons we're enthusiastic about this CARPA, the Canadian Advanced, because it really is intended to put the best minds together and try to figure out, where those big bets could pay off. The one thing, people talk about DARPA in the US and how it was instrumental in creating the internet and GPS and so on. But, there has to be a willingness to fail as well. I mean, you make some of these bets and not all of them will pay off. But there certainly is an opportunity. We need to think about being more strategic about seizing those opportunities.
And the other opportunity is, so the carbon capture and storage is, I have no doubt that human ingenuity and engineers at companies like Shell can figure out how to do some pretty phenomenal things, and the opportunities that Susanna noted in terms of the production opportunities for fuels, using that as an input in different types of materials. Seems like lots of potential there. But at the moment, it's a little bit tough in Canada, because our biggest emitters, because of the way we structure the carbon price, many of them don't pay most of the price on carbon. The average price on carbon for the largest emitter in Canada is around 7% of what the full price is at the moment, and projected into this decade around there. So it's the biggest emitters are paying, in many cases, the least amount of carbon tax, and that's being renegotiated now. But do you think, is there a deal to be made here where sort of the biggest emitters agree to pay closer to the fair share or full price of carbon, with the output-based pricing system being revamped, and then there's a bit of a deal there to be had on the tax credit, so there's sort of a little give and take? Do you sort of see that as a?
I do, but it's important to point out that the reason why they're not paying the full carbon price today is because none of their competitors are elsewhere. The Europeans have an emissions trading system, but they have been giving out a lot of free allowances. That the US doesn't have a carbon price, except in a few states. And so, the policy has to move in tandem. As the price increases, obviously industries will pay a lot more. But we also need to be sure that, the Prime Minister said in Glasgow that, the best solution would be a global price on carbon. And that would certainly level the playing field, but we're a long way from achieving that. So we need to move in careful steps to ensure that, we really are allowing our low carbon and our our cleanest industries to thrive in Canada, and not simply adding more costs that make them uncompetitive.
But I think that's true with what Jaime was talking about at the beginning for cement and steel, things that are really carbon intensive to produce, where if you have to pay the $30 or $50 price on carbon, you're out of business. China is just, or the US will flood us. But with respect to upstream or production of oil and gas extraction, it really doesn't move the needle too much in terms of the price of a barrel of oil. It's more in the sub 10% range. It's not in the sort of 60, 70% range like it is for the carbon intensive materials. And so given that this bold proposal that Business Council is making, and is a big part of our discussion right now, for a large tax credit, which some people will see as a subsidy, but it could be an investment in innovation for carbon capture and storage. In that context, do you think there's room for a little deal making to happen so we can get some innovation and get things moving?
Yes, I do. And of course, the investment tax credit is only one part of the whole package that would stimulate more carbon capture in Canada. Susanna mentioned earlier the low carbon fuel standard and the opportunity to create credits that can, at the end of the day, CCUS in particular is not an investment that enhances efficiency or productivity. It's essentially a cost to that company. And so we need to figure out a way to ensure that the companies that are willing to do that can generate some kind of revenue from it, can have part of that risk. And we are talking about de-risking some very expensive investments that hopefully, as we gain more experience, we've had Shell's Quest project and Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan for several years, and we've learned a lot. And through further investment in CCUS, we can bring down the costs and make it more affordable and more attractive to a range of industries, not just here in Canada, but elsewhere as well. So we need a combination of policies to make CCUS work.
That's helpful. And you'd mentioned too that the policy certainty is important, but also a lot of investments are being made now independent of policy, just because the growth is so profound. And we've seen the companies investing the most in these areas prospering the most in many cases. But when you talk about the long-term importance of policy, because it still does matter, what would be your message to, in the Netherlands and the UK, this isn't an issue. All the parties kind of agree. But what would be your message in Canada to the sort of the folks that are current policymakers and aspiring policymakers from all parties in terms of what you really need to take to heart?
Well, I think we do need, the business community, the people that I talk to have accepted carbon pricing as a major tool. It's not the only one, but the Business Council has had a formal position in favor of carbon pricing since 2007. So it is part of the package. We need to move forward. I think we need to design it in a way that the impact on consumers is not excessive, nor the impact on competitiveness of Canadian industry. But there is a way forward to bring the policies in alignment. Part of the challenge still is getting alignment across the country. With we have multiple now GHG reporting systems, multiple pricing systems across the country. That's not really that helpful to Canadian industry. But we really need to think about and have conversations about what's a policy package that really will support the long-term transition that a lot of industries are trying to make to a low carbon future.
With a similarly high level of climate ambition. Across
yeah.
That's a helpful message too. So we've covered a lot of ground here just in these initial questions, and there's a whole slew of questions in the Q&A. But before we get to those, it would be really interesting to get the perspective from Jean-Marie and Jaime, who've been listening in. We've covered all sorts of ground, from the opportunities for aviation to go sustainable through the various efficiencies, but the sort of more transformational areas of sustainable aviation, biofuels, and the supply chain issues that go with that, and the need to sort of work together through those supply chains like Shell Air France KLM are doing. We looked at some of these huge opportunities facing Canada on green electricity, green metals, hydrogen, and it's, as Susanna kind of pointed out, sometimes the colors confuse things. Better to look at the numbers in terms of carbon intensity and the opportunities for us to really leverage a lot of our strengths in Canada. And through these prisms of the three companies that are participating, from the healthcare, transportation, aviation, and energy, both traditional forms of hydrocarbon energy and then these new fast-growing forms. What have been your thoughts? What's been going through your head? Your sort of reactions, comments, be really interesting. Maybe start with you, Jean-Marie.
Thanks, Toby. So really interesting discussions. Many points resonated. Maybe pick up on a few things. So one was sort of that focus on clean technology, and in particular, a number of the speakers talked about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And John mentioned the sort of new proposed tax credit, which was the subject of a consultation period up until the end of 2021, and should be forthcoming with more information shortly. But also the fact that that's another area where we have a collaboration with governments, with industry, academia, et cetera, to develop a CCUS strategy for Canada. And I think maybe a little bit of a signal of sort of the direction that we're trying to go as policymakers is looking at these more challenging areas like CCUS, where cost-wise still very expensive. As Susanna mentioned, we've got price signals in place with carbon pricing out to 2030. We have other government investments as well, both federally and provincially, but a lot of work still to unpack. How do we kind of move CCUS along through all of its various applications? And as both John and Susanna mentioned, going from sort of these pilot projects or these one-off projects to actually building infrastructure, pipelines to transport CO2 as well. So I think these sort of collaborative discussions, getting all the right people to the table to talk about what is our strategy for this for Canada, both domestically, but then also from that export perspective, because that's a huge component. I think when we look at CCUS, when we look at hydrogen, like these areas where Canada really does have a competitive advantage, we need to look at both aspects. And then if I think about, I think it was John that mentioned sort of electrification. So one thing that's, I think, very clear to everyone is to get to net zero, we need to electrify as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So that's our transportation systems, that's industry to the extent we can, that's our buildings. And so, looking at what are the policy signals that we need to send domestically, but then how do we work across the country? So talking with provinces and territories about those interties, those grid connections, both internal to provinces and then between provinces. And that's a key part of that. Huge investments, complicated. But again, where a lot of work is being done, and including on increasing capacity for renewable energy, looking at battery storage technologies. So I would say my main takeaway here is how much has been done over the past 5 years or more, both at the government level, federally, provincially, territorially, but private sector as well. We're moving so rapidly. I think we know where we need to go. But there's still some work ahead of us, but just really inspired by the key messages that I've heard here today from all of the speakers. I think very much government and industry pulling in the same direction here, and just reinforcing that need to continue that collaboration.
Thanks, Jean-Marie. And the last word is yours, Jaime.
Thank you very much. This is the Dutch Sustainable Growth Coalition. It's been a wonderful network. I happened this week to have another call also with Mexico, and you see the difference in level of maturity in the discussion in Canada is really encouraging. And not to say that Mexico isn't, but it's a whole different level of government engagement with the private sector. And the companies are mature, but the environment is more difficult to work in. And I love to see the dialogue between Susanna and Catherine. You really see two industries that obviously are very much linked, working on this together, and the governments to really reshape the supply chains of sustainable aviation fuels. And the role of the government is to set very clear targets to create a level playing field, because the first movers are taking quite a few chances, and to make sure that everybody else that joins in later does this, and also companies like Catherine's, or sorry, like Susanna's, will be able to provide for a broader market. And it's not just with aviation fuels, not just for aviation, it's the same product that we need for shipping and other industries. So it's also looking at collaborative amongst the industries to do that, but just listening to them was very encouraging. And Afifa really touched on circular economy, and I think that's something that we are not doing enough. We often in climate talk about stranded assets, and we think about fossil fuels, but there's also stranded opportunities. And I think, or as of yet, stranded opportunities, and that's all the resources that are already in our products in our countries. And that's, of production value, of geopolitical value, to reuse it better. So Philips has been really leading as a company to look at it, and some other industries as well that weren't on the call here. You see that the car industry actually is doing quite well on circularity, and many others, but yet the society is not built to be a circular society, and we need to do that also from a nature perspective. And John, for me, it was just sitting back and listening, because Ines already sent me, the ambassador sent me already messages, when are you coming to Canada? The house where the royal family was housed is free for now, because the opposition leader is out. So I could even stay there and making jokes and that sort. So I need to come, and listen to John was great, just to sit back and listen to where Canada is going and what the future economy of Canada is going to look like. And I see a lot of things that are quite different than the Netherlands, but also mostly commonalities, that we're all going through the same process, same thought process. So I think we can move quite well forward. And I just wanted to use this moment, because I have to head off to another call. I already said this is a very interesting meeting. I'll be late to join the other meeing, but I really want to thank the Dutch Embassy and Jean-Marie to join in discussion in this, and Toby for hosting this session so well, and the Corporate Knights for organizing it. And it's been quite an inspiring discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jaime, and thanks everyone else and everyone for joining. It's been an inspiring discussion, and to your words, Jaime, may we leave no opportunity stranded as we go forward with conviction and a greater sense of urgency. So thank you, and have a good rest of the week. Take care.